Okay, so today we're continuing through chapter 2, specifically verses 11 to 14. This particular portion of the latter half of this chapter flows directly into itself, so one to another. So verse 11 all the way through to the end is really the one discourse. We're going to do it across 2 weeks. Okay, so today verses 11 to 14, the next lesson 15 through to the end of the chapter, verse 21 there. So let's read the passage and then we'll go from there. So Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to shrink back and separate himself, fearing the party of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result being that even Barnabas was carried away by the hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before everyone, "If you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?" Let's pray. Blessed Father, who calls all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned there just briefly in the introduction, this passage flows really through the rest of this chapter, and we're going to do it across 2 lessons to be able to cover the detail in sufficient quantity and quality. You can already tell kind of a bit of the dynamic, what's going on here as Paul is recounting this instance that occurred in Antioch. It's following on, of course, from the latter half of chapter 1 into the beginning of chapter 2, wherein Paul was recounting his conversion and essentially defending his apostleship, given that was something that was being targeted by seeking to discredit the messenger. The aim was to discredit, therefore, the message itself. So in this, he then turns his attention toward recounting this particular event which occurs in Antioch. We've covered before, Cephas is the Aramaic name for Peter, what other Jews would have been referring to him as. Of course, the Hebrews didn't speak Hebrew at this particular time. They spoke, Hebrew was almost, at least functionally, a dead language outside of rare circumstances such as the temple or certain places in Babylon, for example, among scholars. But by and large, the other 99% of the time, the Jews were speaking Aramaic, the Western dialect of Aramaic. Cephas is his name. So when we see Cephas, it's Peter that's in view, okay, from his Greek name Petros. So let's begin in verse 11. But when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Now he's about to explain why he stood condemned. So if you're thinking that this sounds ominous, in one sense it is, but he's about to explain why this happened, why he opposed him to his face, a detail which will become more pertinent later on. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, this is referring to James the Just, aka James the brother of the Lord, who was bishop in the Church of Jerusalem, and kind of the leader there among the other elders. So when certain men coming from James, in other words, from the Church of Jerusalem, he before that time, prior to, he in reference to Cephas, Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles. But when the certain men from James, so the Judaizers, I'm just going to call that for shorthand, the Judaizers, but when the Judaizers came, he began to shrink back and separate himself, fearing the party of the circumcision. Okay, the Judaizers who are in view here, right? Those who are still attempting to uphold the practice and method under the Old Covenant of a Gentile coming into the covenant community of God as a proselyte, right? So a convert, would of course go through various stages, including ritual cleansing and circumcision and bringing them under the banner of the Mosaic law, particularly the kind of customary ceremonial aspects, the dietary laws, etc., etc. This is the entire issue of the Judaizing heresy, which demanded, right, in its various iterations has in one form or another demanded, but certainly in its origins here in the first century demands that in order to become a Christian first, the Gentiles must become Jews. So they must become a Jew first, culturally, and then that's the avenue by which they are saved to become a Christian, okay? And the very purpose behind this entire book, of course, as we've been looking at. Prior to this, let's get the dynamic clear, kind of setting the stage, which is what Paul's trying to do for us, okay? As he's recounting this to the Galatians, right? So he's recounting a prior event, right? The time where there was a great famine that came upon Jerusalem. Originally it started in Egypt, as the Roman sources tell us. Agabus had prophesied that this was going to occur, and then of course it did occur during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, which again is testified to by contemporary Roman sources and Jewish sources. It's during this time, prior to the writing of the letter to the Galatians, that when the Judaizers had come down from Jerusalem to Antioch, Peter, who used to be solid on this particular subject, who used to eat with them, right? And so when the eating that's in view here, I'll explain just in a moment. After they arrive, he shrinks back from his fellowship with the Greek and Assyrian Christians, right, in Antioch. So Antioch we've covered before, but I'll just explain again. When I say before, I mean in our previous Bible study. Antioch was the capital of the Roman province of Syria, okay, which covers essentially what today are the nation states of Lebanon and Syria and parts of Turkey as well, southern Turkey. Very important city, of course, historically. Its ethnic makeup, it was a distinctly Greek city. It was founded during the days of Alexander the Great. But its ethnic makeup was predominantly Greek with an Assyrian minority, so not to be confused with the modern nationality of Syrian, which is just largely almost entirely ethnically Arab. Assyrians are the kind of original indigenous people of the nation of Syria, in ancient times was the Assyrian Empire that we read of in the Old Testament. Okay, those people are obviously there, and then there is a pretty sizable Jewish minority in Antioch just by virtue of its relative proximity to Jerusalem and Judea. Okay, so strong Greek presence, relatively strong Assyrian presence, and then also a at least comparatively sizable Jewish cohort there, especially in the church as well. Okay, once the Judaizers come from Jerusalem to Antioch, Peter starts to change his tune. Okay, not necessarily in terms of teaching per se, but certainly in terms of his actions. Right? Whereas he used to be in full open fellowship with the Gentiles, he now stops fellowshipping with them, and hence why Paul uses these words, shrinks back, right, and separates himself out of fear for the Judaizers, right, fearing the party of the circumcision. Okay, so to rewind even further to explain what's going on with this term eating, because that is actually important for us understanding not only today's lesson, but then the next lesson where we finish the chapter off. Throughout the history of the church, especially in the ancient context, in the Greco-Roman context, there were two primary circumstances of kind of fellowship as it related to food, and often they would be sometimes they'd be one and the same. Often they'd be different. Again, it depends on the context. There would be what is generally referred to in Greek culture as an agape feast, right? Or agape being one of the words for love in Greek. A time of fellowship where they would all join together and, have lunch, dinner, etc., whatever. They'd all eat together. They'd join together. They'd dine together. They'd fellowship over food, of course, which is one of the most ancient customs of mankind that we have. Every single culture, it's one of the universal customs of civilization is people dining together, because of course all the opportunity for, other than sustenance, communication with each other, fellowship with each other, bonding, etc., etc. And so that was a practice that was heavily very easily and heavily established in the early church and all the way throughout the history of the church. Hence why even we, in our context, in our time, have church lunches on the last Sunday of every month, as well as on festivals, right? Hence why in the history of the church they've been called feast days. Okay, So feast days, things like obviously Christmas and during Holy Week, Easter and Pentecost and Ascension and All Saints Day and all kinds of various other feast days, because of course Christians would gather together and have a meal.
The door's locked.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay. All good. Hence why in Christian history, in the liturgical calendar, they're called feast days. Okay. The other, obviously, primary meal, which should be fairly obvious, is that of Holy Communion. Okay. Which, as we well know, has been consistently practiced since the very beginning and foundation, including here. Both of these two primary kind of meals, which again sometimes they were done one and the same. More often they were done in the liturgical context, of course, but they were also additionally done at times during these feasts of gathering and fellowshipping over food, and communion could and would often be done during that as well. So it wasn't only done during the liturgy on a Sunday, right? But it was often at times done elsewhere as well. What's in view here is probably both. There is some scholarly debate as to whether one is specifically in view or whether another is, which is a much more kind of complicated subject based on probabilities of how we read and interpret ancient sources in the academic context. However, I, along with many, would argue that certainly what's first and foremost in view is kind of, at least in an ultimate foundational sense, is that of communion. Okay, especially in and when it was practiced among the general agape feast, right, the love feast. Okay, for reasons that I will explain kind of as we get a bit further on into today's lesson. All right, so just put a bookmark in that, and then we'll come back to that concept. All right. So, I'll read verse 12 again as we continue on. For prior to the coming of the certain men from James, from the Church of Jerusalem, in other words, he, Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to shrink back and separate himself, fearing the party of the circumcision, okay, the Judaizers. And the rest of the Jews, in other words, the ones who were not the ones who have come down from Jerusalem, I mean, he's talking about the other Jewish constituent in the Church of Antioch. Make sense? Yep. The rest of the Jews joined him, Peter, in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Okay? So Paul is unraveling kind of the sad and tragic estate that this scenario found itself in. Peter, of course, who is still definitively preeminent in his influence among the apostles during this time, he first starts to separate himself from the Gentiles as a result of his being too afraid of the Judaizers and their influence. As a result, the Barnabas, again, it's not really giving an order here, it's just kind of describing as well. Barnabas also sides with Peter, and Barnabas, who himself was ethnically Jewish, he was born on the island of Cyprus, right? So he was a Jewish Cypriot. But of course, as we know from the book of Acts, was essentially Paul's best friend and travelled with him more than anyone, at least earlier on. Later on, unfortunately, they end up having a major disagreement over whether Mark should come along or what Mark's actions should be, and they end up separating and never actually see each other again. That's another subject, but nevertheless, they were best friends, and certainly no doubt on this division that Barnabas sided with the wrong side upon would have influenced that later separation of Paul and Barnabas. They didn't anathematize each other, they didn't curse each other to condemnation, they just decided to part ways for the better, for each other's betterment. Peter sides with the Judaizers in terms of his actions. Barnabas follows Peter in it. And then now that these two prominent leaders, especially in the case of the Apostle Peter, have decided to go one direction as opposed to another, all of the Jewish cohort among the Church of Antioch side with Peter, and by extension Barnabas, and by extension the Judaizers. Right? He uses a word here which I'll come to in a moment, which is hypocrisy, but just before I get there, what verse 13 very clearly, well, obviously in conjunction with verse 12, but particularly verse 13, what verse 13 very clearly elucidates for all Christians throughout the ages is that the influence of leaders is at times prolific, by nature, not just by coincidence. So what I mean by that is we as human beings, there are those who by and large, again in different roles, different capacities, there are those who are well suited to leadership and there are those who are not well suited to leadership. By definition, most people are not well suited to leadership, otherwise everyone would be a leader and therefore no one would be a leader. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the natural dynamic of how God has ordered and created the world. If everyone in the family, from the mother and the father and all the children, either small or numerous in number, if everyone had an equal democratic vote as to how the house is going to operate, the house would crumble. Right? The natural influence of leaders is, apart from, as the operative word suggests, natural, it is also something that is designed for good. Okay, leadership is inherently good. It is there prior to the fall. It's not a consequence of it. Adam was the leader of his family. He was effectively king. He was to guide and lead not only Eve but also their children and the descendants of them, of mankind. And his failure in leadership is what is then credited as the origin of our curse. Okay? Eve, very obviously being the first mover in that fall, the one who first took that step, is fascinatingly not the one who's ultimately credited as truly responsible. It's very clear from both Old and New Testaments that Adam is the one who is held ultimately responsible, because he bore leadership as their priest and as their king, as their patriarch in that literal sense. And so leadership is something that's designed for good. It's designed to lead people in righteousness and in truth, and in the ways of goodness. The same authority and power, which are separate but related things, but that's a whole other subject, that is inherent in leadership, like any other tool, can also be perverted and corrupted toward not good but evil, toward not righteousness but wickedness, etc., etc. And the influence that kind of comes with that, naturally, because that's how that should work, can also be turned in more malevolent forms as well. It is perfectly normal and natural and actually good that the congregants of the Church of Antioch would seek to follow Peter and the other apostles and the leaders of that church, because that's exactly how God has ordered the world to work. Until those leaders then fall into sin and lead and what now was previously a good, orderly desire of influence to follow where a righteous leader is leading now is turned into something more corrupt. That's why there's a balance on leadership, and that's why that's why leaders must be eternally and perennially reminded of their accountability to God. The divisions and separations of power is a way that modern man has tried to combat potential kind of accretions into tyranny, which is a more sophisticated subject, but nevertheless, in this context, those who had the responsibility to lead in truth and righteousness, did not in this instance. They had been, but then now they weren't. And that is the cause of all of the Jewish congregants, not the Judaizers who had come, but the Jewish congregants already there in Antioch, going astray. Whilst any given Christian of Jewish ethnicity in the Church of Antioch is obviously, there is an element of individual responsibility, right? They're not mindless robots. They do have agency, being made in the image of God. Obviously, they've made a decision there to do this and to follow in this way, but they're not the ones who are ultimately to blame. Peter is ultimately to blame. Barnabas, by extension, is ultimately to blame. And any other unnamed leaders, assuming there were any, who followed them in suit, right? And in this case, followed them in hypocrisy is how Paul describes it, not once but twice, right? In the first clause of the verse, and the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result of even Barnabas being carried away by their hypocrisy, okay? So what is this hypocrisy that is in view? Obviously, hypocrisy is a fairly well understood word in English. We tend to use it quite regularly. It's a transliteration, actually, of the Greek word hypokrisis, which means it's actually a term related to Greek theatre, Greek tragedies and comedies, etc. It was used to describe one who would be acting under a mask. Okay, so in Greek theatre, ancient Greek theatre, which was very prominent, especially in Athens and elsewhere, but all around the Hellenistic world, actors would come out in a costume and a very artistically stylized mask, playing Zeus or Apollo or whichever character they had, or even a historical character perhaps, one of the philosophers or one of the kings of Sparta or statesmen like Pericles of Athens, etc. And then they would do their part in their scene, and they would exit stage left, and then they would go back and change into the next costume to play the next character in the next scene or the next act of the play, if that makes sense. And so this term hypokrisis is used to describe one who's acting under a mask. Well, in this context, it's being applied. This is actually, again, it's not unique to this. It's used by plenty of ancient Greek authors in this way. It's kind of an ironic usage. It's essentially hypocrisy in the ancient Greek context is describing someone who is putting on a mask. They're appearing one way, but then they're really actually different underneath, right? And so it should be fairly obvious to see what the connection is there to the concept of hypocrisy. Someone who acts a certain way in this case, but then in the next scene, the next act of the play, acts differently, right? So it's actually quite a clever usage, especially when it's tied to its original context of the Greek theatre, the ancient Greek theatres. They're one character in scene one, and then they're a completely different character in scene two, and then another character in scene three, etc. This is the nature of hypocrisy. And this can be done through words, it can be done through actions, usually often both in context. There is a delineation. Hypocrisy is not necessarily about not living up to to one's own moral standards. There is a delineation. So if someone has a certain moral standard and then fails to live up to it in a particular instance, that generally we usually classified or categorise that as a moral failing, as opposed to hypocrisy specifically. Whereas hypocrisy specifically has been someone who professes to have a particular view or a particular moral standard, whatever it happens to be, but then clearly across a pattern of behaviour, ongoing, right? Not a momentary instance, but an ongoing kind of pattern of behaviour, very clearly either speaks and or acts, probably usually both, but speaks and or acts differently to whatever that professed ideal happens to be, moral, ethical, philosophical, whatever. That's the nature of hypocrisy. In this context, this is exactly how this applies, where Peter and Barnabas and everyone else up to this point in Antioch had been consummately rock solid on the integration of the Greeks and the Assyrians, in this particular case of Antioch, into the covenant people of God, right? Into the kingdom of God. They knew the gospel full well. They knew that that man is saved apart from works of the law, something which he goes on to really talk about in verse 16, which we'll get to in the next lesson. That one does not actually first convert into the old covenant to get into the new covenant. You are not brought under the law of Moses to uphold that in order to then become a Christian, right? Which is a denial and a rejection of the gospel itself, and of the entrance thereinto. They knew all this, and they'd been practicing that. Now, as soon as the gang of Judaizers had come down from Jerusalem, out of fear, Paul explicitly states, because he was there and he saw it all, out of fear, they started to side with the Judaizers. Not because of some genuine theological commitment or conviction, not because they, reanalyzed their beliefs in light of the Old Testament and concluded reasonably and logically that they were incorrect in what they've been. No, it's just fear. Cowardice, right? Is essentially what that is, right? It's cowardice.
What were the consequences going to be if they didn't? I know they're fearful, but fearful of what were the consequences?
Right. Well, they're not spelled out here, but what kind of consequences would you logically assume? Well, this is entirely how sad, unfortunately, we as people, especially in groups, tend to become. It's not as if the Judaizers are going to lop their heads off. It's not as if the Judaizers are going to come along and burn their houses to the ground and kidnap their wives and children. And no, they're just Peter would just now become unpopular.
Like ostracized.
Ostracized.
Yeah.
It's social pressure. That's all it is. Social pressure. Nothing more. The Judaizers aren't throwing someone in prison. None of the Judaizers are running around, rampaging through villages. It's not, no. Not an ounce of physical consequence.
Excluded from the old group.
Yep, excluded. Yep, social exclusion. Yep. Social exclusion. Yeah, that's all it is. It's quite literally nothing more and nothing less than social pressure. Falling out of favour.
It's like being a Christian now with your old friends.
Yeah. Falling out of favour with the Church of Jerusalem. Falling out of favour with those who are influential and prominent in the Church of Jerusalem is more specifically what the issue is. Yep. No longer being welcomed at the table in Jerusalem. No longer being welcomed at the homes of the prominent men in Jerusalem. It is what's the polite way of putting it? It's the most pathetic and pusillanimous version of this kind of hypocrisy and caving to peer pressure, especially among men. Obviously, it's wrong to cave to peer pressure, whether you're man or woman, but there is a difference in implication between the two, admittedly. There is, men, of course, need brotherhood and friendship, but there is a general expectation, and I do think rightfully so, for individual resilience among men to be more prominent. I think that's a normal and natural thing. And certainly the scriptures communicate that. In this context here, hence why I use the word kind of pathetic and pusillanimous, in other words, weak and cowardly, is that there's no physical implications here, right? In one sense, right, and again, it doesn't ultimately justify it, it just makes it more explainable. In one sense, people caving to threats of real significant chances of violence is understandable. Okay, there's a difference in the way I'm using the word understandable as opposed to justifiable, because ultimately principles still do need to stand, right? We just came through Sunday when we were talking about All Saints' Day and about how many people have been martyred for the faith, right? And so if Christians just caved every time there was a threat of physical violence, then we wouldn't have taken, the Christian religion wouldn't have even taken off the tarmac. However, when there's no threat to physical, like there's no prospect of physical violence, it's just purely like social in that sense, it's just indescribably pathetic. Indescribably pathetic. At least during COVID, again, to extend an element of an olive branch, at least during COVID, there was reasonable prospects of people's businesses being shut down for lack of compliance, right? Or being terminated or fired from your job, right? I've never faulted people for making decisions under that kind of pressure when their own governments have threatened them with the ruin of their livelihood for failure to comply with X, Y, Z. However, in this kind of context, it's literally just a matter of no longer being able to move in the social circles to which you were previously accustomed. There is no more pathetic version, and it happens all the time. That's something that's always been the case throughout human history. It's no different today than it was then. The way this tends to operate these days is equally as prolific. It's no less prolific is what I'm trying to say. It just occurs in different ways. Church ministers and theologians in academia, both in their own avenues, engage in equally as pathetic hypocrisy because they are afraid of losing their position as a minister in their sizable church with multi-million-dollar budgets, or likewise they're afraid of losing their place at the table that is in the ivory tower of academia. And so they will go along with the flow of whatever ridiculous ideas happen to permeate. They won't challenge things that need to be challenged. They won't stand up and say no to things that need to be said no to, et cetera, on all kinds of issues, because of the ultimate fear of losing their reputation. Right? Now, there's a reasonable avenue, or realm rather, within which losing one's reputation is important and significant. It's why we have laws about defamation and libel and other such things, right? Character assassination is a legitimate and serious thing. I'm talking about losing reputation for the right reasons, right? Among people whose repute you shouldn't give a tinker's cuss about. That's what I mean, right? In this case here, it's an attempt to keep reputation with people who should have been shown the door a long time ago. Right?
So just with Peter, because I kind of feel a bit for Peter, because he's the same dude that denied Christ 3 times. He's got a little track record, hasn't he? You've got to, it's easy to sit here. Yeah, correct.
Exactly. There's a balance, and I was going to mention the same thing. I was going to mention the same thing later, but we can talk about it now. Yeah.
It's wrong, but it kind of gives us hope as well. Correct. That God uses all sorts of.
Peter is the eldest. Yep. No, 100%. Peter is the eldest.
We've all got our deficiencies.
Correct, including him. Yeah, Peter is the eldest of the apostles. He is the eldest of the apostles. He is therefore meant to be the wisest of the apostles. One of the very first who were called, of course. He knew Jesus longer than almost anyone, than Andrew and John, of course, who were alongside him. He, again, instances of weakness like the event around the crucifixion of Christ, right, and his thrice denial of Christ, is again a similar instance. Now, at least in that scenario, there was a legitimate threat of violence and imprisonment, right? Doesn't justify it. Makes it somewhat understandable, okay? And there's all kinds of stuff I'm saying to you. I'm using this distinction between understandable and justifiable very particularly. Understandable means understandable as it relates to the human experience, right? You can look at that and go, oh yeah, I can understand how a human being would do that, and I probably might have even fallen for that too. Doesn't justify it, but it makes it more empathetically understandable. And again, there's all kinds of scenarios like that. There are plenty. There are scenarios in the early church. There are scenarios in medieval times. There are scenarios all over the place of Christians denouncing the faith under torture, which just about every one of us would do too, right? Because there's just the human spirit reaches a limit under torture, and there are Christians like Thomas Cranmer, for example, Archbishop of Canterbury during the Reformation, when he was imprisoned during the reign of Bloody Mary. He was tortured for 4 months. Yeah. Right? and recanted, but then when he was put to the stake, he recanted his recantation and came back to the side of the angels proverbially.
Didn't he put his hand in the fire first that wrote that
Yeah,
he
that's
sinned?
that's the story you're talking about. Yeah. If anyone was tortured for 4 months straight, they would also succumb to. So that's what I'm saying about understandable and elements like that. In this case, though, it's not like Peter's denial. Right? This is much easier to withstand to a degree. But in this case, also again, he's a Jew. It's his own ethnic kin, K-I-N, who have come down. It's his people in every legitimate, rightful sense, but also now there is this reality that Christians are his people. Every one of these Judaizers we've explained before are in the church, and they absolutely claim to be Christians. They're not, as Paul explains. They're heretics, and they are deniers of the gospel, and they're not real in their profession of faith. But that's the dynamic that kind of is going on, and so it's entirely social pressure and fear of losing reputation and fear of falling out of favour or out of sort with the Church of Jerusalem, with this powerful, influential element that's kind of sprung up in the Church of Jerusalem, etc., etc. And it carries even Barnabas off as well, which is even more wild. Barnabas had much more, would go on to have much more influence with regards to the Gentiles than Peter ever did. That's why we saw earlier even in this chapter, in the last lesson, that Peter's primary ministry was to his fellow Jews, whereas Paul's was to the Greeks and the Romans and the Celts, etc., to the Gentiles. But they're hypocrites as a result. Okay, they know full well that the things that are claimed by the Judaizers are not biblical. They know full well that it's heresy, and he knows full well, Peter, that is, he knows full well that it's a denial ultimately of the gospel. It's completely out of sorts with what Jesus did and taught, and he sides with them anyway, right? Because he caves to social pressure. Hence why Paul says, out of fear for them, right? Fearing the party of the circumcision, verse 12. Then in verse 14, but when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, in regards to the whole group now, so Peter, Barnabas, the Judaizers, whatever their number were, plus all of the Jewish congregants among the church, when I saw they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before everyone, quote, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you now compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Yeah. We're not going to get much into the wording of that, of his opening rhetorical question, because it flows into the next passage. But we're going to focus just on the beginning of it, right? Verse 14, the first half of verse 14. When I saw that that group, were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, right? In other words, they were not being honest about it. They were not being truthful. They were not actually preaching and teaching the gospel and living the principles of it anymore. They had now departed from it and diverted from it. He then says to Cephas before everyone, he confronts Peter publicly, right? He doesn't specifically say it here, but it almost certainly for a fact would have been at one of these feasts, okay? Because that's really the only context in which that would make sense, especially when he says before everyone, right? So there's a couple of things to note. Let's paint the scene, right? And again, this is a reasonable articulation of what would have been going on. I'm not the first person who's articulated in this fashion. You can read everyone from early church fathers all the way through the medieval period who would frame it this way too. We're making logical inferences from the details we've been given. They are joined for either an agape feast, Holy Communion, or both, particularly Holy Communion. The food that Peter, Barnabas, the Judaizers who have visited now from Jerusalem, plus all the ethnic Jews, Jewish Christians, are eating this type of food and the Gentiles get a different type of food, right? And or they sit on this side and the Greeks sit on this side. So separation physically, right? Here's Paul looking at this. He's looking at Peter and Barnabas and the Judaizers and the ethnically Jewish Christians eating all of their kosher food and their lack of lobster and lack of this and lack of that and whatever else and lack of bacon and all the nice things that under the old covenant were there for typological reasons, which are then fulfilled in Christ. And these other, now second class kind of Christians have been given different food. Not because of some genuine kind of issue of conscience like you have in Corinth later on, right? Where you've got younger Christians, or those Christians who are newer in the faith, who are still very wary and cautious of eating meat that's had anything even vaguely to do with temple sacrifice, okay? And you've got the more mature Christians, doesn't necessarily mean older in age, but those who've been Christian for longer, more mature in the faith, who know and understand that there's nothing magical or superstitious about the meat that just got sacrificed to the idols at the temple of Zeus in Corinth, which is now being sold in the marketplace in the Agora right next door, right? And that you're not going to be cursed or you're not going to be plagued by demons if you now eat them, right? So it's an issue of immaturity versus maturity, right? And so in the case of Corinth, you can read about this in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 10 particularly. He advises the what he calls the weaker brothers, right? Those who are not as mature in the faith, to, if their conscience is torn apart by eating that meat, then don't eat it, right? Because it's better for your conscience to be right before God. But the mature Christians know full well that there's nothing magically demonic about whatever, and they're fine to eat it. The stronger Christians don't look down, don't despise your younger, less mature and or weaker brothers in the faith for not having the Christian maturity yet, right? And also in the same direction, those younger Christians, less mature, who have the conviction of, I can't eat this, don't get all holier than thou and start chastising those who are eating it, right? Peace, right? It's not like that. This is not that kind of issue, right? Where it's issues of conscience or it's a health-related thing. Those are completely different, right? You can work in those dynamics. This is actually a entirely theological outworking, right, that directly implicates what the very nature of the gospel is, okay, right? It's entirely different. It's not just an issue of custom or of personal conviction or choice, right? Oh, I prefer not to eat bacon and this and that and other types of non-kosher food from the Old Testament. It's not that case, right? It's actually the outright demand on the part of the Judaizers and those who they've now swung to their side, that real Christians must do the thing that we're doing, right? To be saved, to be justified before God. That's the fundamental problem. So definitely the food would have been different. That's just a given. They probably would have been separated by seating arrangement. There's no automatic guarantee of that, but it's probably a logical consequence. So you've got Paul, who at this point now is the only ethnic Jew at the church in Antioch who's actually siding with the Greeks and the Assyrians. Make sense? Okay. And this is not to, I know I keep pumping up Paul, but it's just acknowledging him for his achievements. Paul is more knowledgeable on the Old Testament and the law than, definitely than every Jewish Christian in Antioch combined. The Judaizers, plenty of them were former Pharisees, but none of them were on Paul's level, right? So I'm not trying to demean them unnecessarily. my tendency in that scenario would be to just simply side with whichever side Paul was on, by virtue of his mere accomplishment. But other than that, that itself is not a guarantee, because after all, Peter is also highly accomplished in a general sense anyway, not academically speaking, but in terms of the church and ministry and etc. And he's actually fallen on the wrong side of this issue, right? So that's why, even again, the individual person cannot ultimately be the litmus test for which direction you go, right? The fact that's the whole reason I was talking about earlier about the nature of leadership and its influence, is that leadership is influential by nature and by design, and it should be, because on the whole, that's how human beings work. Minority lead, majority follow, and it works well. Until either in one direction or another, the contingent of leadership go off the track and lead the majority with them in that, or even on the flip side, the majority of those being led through nothing more than kind of just the democratic mob of might equals right in terms of mass numbers, decide that they want to go a certain direction and just decide to oust their leaders. Speaking of the Church of Corinth, they actually did that after biblical times, not long after. In the decades that followed the end of the Apostolic Age, by the time you get to about the 90s, kind of in the transition into the beginning of the Flavian dynasty, by the time you get to the 90s AD, Clement, who is one of the ministers in the Church of Rome, we studied him in church history actually, known as the Apostolic Fathers. He writes a famous letter to the Corinthians because a large, sizable cohort of the young members of like in the young in age, I mean young members of the Church of Corinth, oust their entire eldership. And he writes to them, correctly chastising them for it and telling them to reinstate them. So kind of a revolt in that sense against their leadership. It goes both ways. In this case, it's that former, right? The leader's leading, right? But now that we've kind of set the stage of this, right? You've got a visible thing, and Paul's looking at this, and Paul's seeing it. He is seeing the very self-righteous way in which now Peter and Barnabas and the Judaizers and all the ethnic Jewish Christians have established themselves at the feast with their food, which is different from this food, and probably also then they're sitting over here and the Greeks and the Assyrians are sitting over here. And Paul does something that is very consistent with his character. Paul is very much courageous, but his courage is very obviously from or by the grace of God. Paul, we've kind of explained this in our study on Acts. Paul is rather clearly described as not being anything very physically prominent. He wasn't tall. He wasn't. He's described as being fairly slender and frail, especially toward older age. His voice. He didn't have a giant, booming voice or a deep voice that carried greatly. His voice was nothing to remark at, really. In fact, it's described as the opposite usually. So it's why when he and Barnabas are in Derbe, one of these Galatian cities, the Greeks there, the pagan Greeks, think that he and Barnabas are the coming of Zeus and Hermes, right? Hermes or Hermes, the messenger god, among many other traits. That's who they thought him to be, of course, because he was the one speaking. And Barnabas, who was quite tall and athletic and powerful, they thought he was Zeus. Yeah, and the Book of Acts actually very clearly describes that. Why do I bother pointing that out? Because Paul was nothing. There was nothing even vaguely physically intimidating in a good or a bad sense about Paul. Okay, his courage was spiritual. It was spiritual courage, and so he has the fortitude and the courage to very clearly, almost without any having to muster anything, I would imagine, but maybe he did. I have no idea. Again, we don't know. Is openly now in the middle of this, or as he's come into the room, or whatever happens to be, whatever the circumstance is, he doesn't call out the Jewish congregants, so like the ethnically Jewish Christians, right? He doesn't call out the Jewish Christians. He doesn't call out Barnabas, his own best friend. He doesn't even call out the Judaizers, who are the ones who have brought all these problems. He beelines straight for Peter, okay? Because of exactly the premise of leadership I was talking about earlier. Eve is the one who first took the fruit, and Adam was the one who was responsible. Okay? The Judaizers are the one who brought this heresy into the church. Barnabas also, his own best friend, had sided with them. In terms of just sheer proportional numbers, Peter's just one man compared to the hundreds probably of Jews, ethnically Jewish Christians right here in the Church of Antioch. It's Peter who's ultimately responsible, right? The buck stops somewhere, and the reality is that in this scenario, the buck stops with Peter. Peter and Paul at this point are not greatly acquainted. Obviously, they've met, and he recounts this. They met back in Jerusalem, of course, after Paul had gone off. Again, I'm recounting stuff from the last chapter, but Paul had gone off after his Damascene conversion into Arabia for 3 years. He then arrives, comes to Jerusalem, etc., not once but twice, right? He's met Peter, of course. He's met the other apostles, but they haven't spent, years and years and years laboring together, right? They're not. Peter is way more acquainted with James than Paul is with either Peter or James, right? Because Peter and James, that is, and the other apostles, and some of the other apostles have spent years and years and years. They've been in Jerusalem for like 15 years, especially James. James is just in Jerusalem. Later on, there's other action, but here, Jerusalem. He doesn't go after his best friend, who is obviously the most acquainted with, the closest with. He doesn't go after the Judaizers, some of whom are Pharisees, who there's a link there. He goes after one of the people who's actually least acquainted with, just proportionally speaking, other than the Jewish congregants, and openly confronts him right there in front of everyone. Okay? This isn't private. There's nothing that's even trying to hint here that this is private at all. He doesn't pull him aside. He doesn't set a time to have a private meeting with him, and they consult their schedules, and no. He just, right in front of the entire church, openly starts calling him out on it. Right? Obviously, the content of that we'll get into in the next lesson. But this does a couple of things for us and for any Christian who ever reads this. Is one, it demonstrates the urgency of it. So Paul's not wanting to allow this to linger on any longer. Right? So there's a sense of time, right? Urgency. Severity would be the other one. This is not a manual on how you should go about conflict resolution per se, because there's actually a majority of the time openly, publicly confronting something is not actually the best strategic move. Again, it depends on the circumstance. But what it does tell us in regards to severity is that there are times where the move actually is public confrontation. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that's all of that is an exercise in not only principle but wisdom, so applied knowledge, applied principle. It takes wisdom to figure out what the best strategic move is there. In this case, strategically, Paul decides, and I think rightfully, as many do, of course, that the way to kind of cut the head off of the problem is to directly confront the leader who bears the most responsibility, and in front of everyone. It's not hidden. Everyone sees it. All the Jews see it. Jewish Christians see it. All the Greek Christians see it. All of the Assyrian Christians see it. All the Judaizers see it, and his own best friend Barnabas sees it. Without question, he would have been most heartbroken and disappointed and ticked off, to use a more polite term, at Barnabas. That I could almost guarantee, right? His own best friend. Paul, yeah, I could, if I was to guess, right, I would say that he would be most disappointed in Barnabas. Yeah. But like I said, Barnabas is ethnically Jewish, but he's born in Cyprus. He's not born in Judea. He's born in a Greek city on a Greek island, surrounded by Greek culture. Grew up culturally Greek, right? Hence why he has the name Barnabas, right? Barnabas, the Greek name. He's entirely culturally Greek by that metric. Again, ethnically Jewish, and obviously still has that custom and culture, of course, but very well ingratiated, entirely Hellenized Jew, as we would say. And then becomes that close traveling companion of Paul, again, his best friend up until their unfortunate separation and departure from each other. But he doesn't go after his best friend because he doesn't need to. He goes after the person most responsible, and it will be very obvious to Barnabas what the message is. He doesn't actually need to speak to Barnabas directly because Barnabas can sit back and bear witness to everything he says to Peter, which is all that he would say to Barnabas in the first place. And by going directly at the person most responsible, right, in terms of leadership, not in terms of the problem. Again, Peter didn't bring the problem here. The Judaizers did. Okay, that should be fairly clear, right? But in terms of responsibility, for this having festered up and become problems, he goes after Peter. He goes after the one who is preeminent among the apostles. Again, Peter's not selfish, he's not self-righteous, he doesn't consider himself better than the other apostles, but it's very clear, especially from the first half of the book of Acts, that Peter is preeminent, kind of a primus inter pares of sorts, a first among equals, if you might imagine. Peter is the eldest of the apostles, so there's that natural kind of deference to his age, right? He's the eldest of them. We know he's the eldest for a couple of reasons. More, just if you're wondering, there's one in particular. There is an instance in the Gospels, I have to find the reference, but where Jesus is with his disciples, of course, Peter and the rest of them, and only Jesus and Peter go into the temple to pay the tax. Under Roman law at that time, only those above the age of 20 were eligible to pay the tax. Okay, so that tells us, obviously we know Christ was around the age of 30, and that tells us that Peter was at least 20 or in his early 20s, whereas the others would have been late teens, right? None of the disciples were old men, right? You were a man from what we would now call early teenagehood, right? So, by going after the person most responsible in terms of leadership, not practical actions, it then filters down from there. That's the entire aim of why he's doing this, okay? Because of the nature of leadership. It's leadership that's caused this problem to just be contained to the Judaizers and actually now flow out into the rest of at least half the congregation. Does that make sense? It's the fact, this started to change, and again, this is why Paul explains it in this order. Again, I'm not just making it up. He's explaining it in this order for a reason. The heresy of the Judaizers starts to spill out among the rest of the congregation as soon as Peter sides with them. That's the linchpin, right? And hopefully that should be fairly obvious, right? That's why he begins by talking, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned, and then starts to explain why, okay? He opposes him to his face because it's when he started to cave into the Judaizers that Barnabas followed after him, and then now that both Peter and Barnabas had followed in suit, then the ethnically Jewish Christians followed their leaders into the hypocrisy. Yeah. Like I said, we'll then actually start from like technically verse 14b, so in other words the second half of verse 14, and go through the rest of the chapter in the next lesson in terms of the content of what he talks about, what he discusses, and says to Peter. And if I feel the need, I might even isolate certain parts, and might do that in a separate lesson, but that'll be dependent on time. But nevertheless, hopefully a lot of these kind of principal lessons we can see even just from these couple of verses, 11 to 14, on the significance of leadership, not only its nature, but also in its kind of practical reality, so its influence, the nature of responsibility as tied to leadership, not to the denigration of individual agency, right? Because even if leaders and therefore their followers go a certain way, that doesn't mean that you just are now in the morally clear to kind of toe the line, that you still shouldn't do that, right? So it's not an excusing of it, but it's entirely understandable that the ethnically Jewish Christians in Antioch went the way they did, because after all, their leaders were leading them that way, right? And they're not ultimately responsible. That's the operative word. It's not that they're not responsible. No, they're responsible for themselves individually, but they're not ultimately responsible for the scenario or the circumstance. The leaders are. And so it teaches us so many things. It teaches us the nature of leadership, that again, we can't throw baby out with bathwater. Leadership is a good and righteous thing. Leadership's a gift from God. Leadership is something that is inherent to the design of the world and of humanity. There is a hierarchy of those who are suited for leadership and those who are not. And it's totally fine to be suited for leadership and totally fine to not to be suited for leadership. In fact, life's often much more simpler when one's not in a position of leadership. Because like you're seeing here, the burden of responsibility is that Peter hasn't caused the problem. Like, that's very clear. The Judaizers have caused the problem. There's no confusion about that in this book of Galatians, right? The Judaizers are the cause of the problem. They're the root of the problem, okay? Peter's not the cause of the problem. Peter is responsible for the problem. Peter could turn around and say, well, that's not fair because I didn't cause the problem, to which Paul would only say, doesn't matter and don't care. Right? Doesn't matter, don't care. Because it doesn't matter whether you caused the problem. You're responsible for the problem now. And Peter came to a crossroad where he had the ability to solve the problem, fix it, or to actually side with the problem, and he chose to side with the problem. So now you're responsible for the problem. And Peter is actually definitively, and so now not only now, as you've come full circle, now not only in this instance was Peter responsible for the problem, he was responsible for the problem from the get-go, but now he has actually become the cause of the greater problem. Because the problem was contained to the Judaizers, yeah? You understand what I mean? So Barnabas hadn't fallen into hypocrisy yet. The ethnically Jewish Christians had not fallen into hypocrisy yet. Peter had not yet. Peter now falls into the hypocrisy, and then the dominoes start falling. Barnabas falls, probably some of the other elders, unnamed elders here fall. Jewish Christian congregants start falling as well. It's just a domino effect. As soon as Peter falls, the rest of those dominoes start falling. Do you know what I mean? So now, what started as him being responsible, now in his failure to responsibly handle the problem, he actually has now become the cause of the greater problem. Yeah. Again, I can see you talking about these issues for a while, but yeah. An astronomically and gargantuanly large percentage of leaders in just about any sector in Australian life at the moment don't have even the faintest understanding of that dynamic, in my experience. We are in such a dearth and wasteland of leadership that we are just aimlessly floating through time at the moment. This goes in regards to just about everywhere: our politics, our education, our economics, our churches, etc., etc. People who are in positions of leadership have not even the faintest business being in leadership. They don't have the character, they don't have the skill, they don't have that too. Falls under the character, I suppose, yeah. And it's not because I think I'm all so great and everything else like that. It's just simply an observation. We don't train leadership anywhere near as adequately as we should. There are very, very, very few places that genuine leadership acumen is targeted and developed and taught, especially when you're talking about kind of at the teenage level, high school level. an unfathomably tiny percentage of schools actually have any meaningful ability to produce genuine leaders in various sectors of society anymore. And unfortunately, our churches have become largely no different. And so when you're in a what's the term I'm looking for? When you're in a drought of leadership, a kind of leadership drought, everyone else just tends to suffer as a result of it, because, like I said, people go the way that their leaders go, and that's, again, by design and nature, that is a good thing, because when leaders are going in the right direction, then the people follow in the right direction. It's the whole reason why the shepherd analogy or the shepherd motif is so popular in the scriptures, other than the fact that it's obviously common ancient agrarian imagery. But the sheep follow where the shepherd goes, and that's a perfectly natural and good thing, because it protects the sheep. It leads the sheep to green pastures where they eat and where they're sustained and when they grow and where they flourish, right? But if the shepherd's an idiot or just a coward, then they get led into the wilderness, or he doesn't protect them from wolves, and the sheep get devoured. So yeah, this will continue to follow on. As I said, the substance of what he says is equally as important as the... Here he's just been describing the context, right? So Paul has been like laying out all the context, right? And it's throughout the latter half of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, and then especially now, this isolated incident, or this, as he zooms into the specific incident here in verses 11 and 14, right? So we're getting a lot of contextual stuff, and now we're going to get some of the substance of the theology and the principle and such, as we pick up in verse 14b through to the end, verse 21, next lesson, all right? Cool. So, that's it. Anyone have any questions or anything?
I was going to say, I was just thinking, well, he had to step on him straight away and hardly to bring him back in line for...
Yep, correct. Yeah, I mean, look, part of it in
the rest of the...
Yeah, 100%. Part of the strategy here, from the perspective of leadership, is that anyone with wisdom should be able to tell that the longer this scenario here specifically lingers or goes on, the more entrenched Peter and Barnabas will be in that hypocrisy, the more difficult it will be to bring them out, right? Because you're not just dealing with an individual in that scenario. So again, with individuals, I'm saying a lot of this is strategic. It's just wisdom. You're having to assess information and make judgment calls, which is just entirely an act of wisdom. It's applied knowledge. There's no manual or guidebook on how to step by step, whatever. If it was just Peter singular and no one else, this strategy would be way off track, right? Apart from the fact that it wouldn't be helpful, it also just wouldn't be terribly ethically conductive or conducive to the scenario, sorry. It's because now, like, again, we don't know what the ratio was between the ethnically Jewish Christians, the ethnically Greek Christians, the ethnically Assyrian Christians. But either way, we can at least, just for semantics, or for argument's sake, kind of semantically think of it as half-half, just for simplicity. You've got like half the congregation who have now fallen into this heresy, right, and this problem, right? It's not just one person. We're not just going to pull aside one person and have a private chat, because that can be done, right? You can also afford to take more time when it's just an individual basis, right? Again, relatively speaking, at least. When it's an entire big group thing like this, there's no let's have a private whatever. It's much more effective to come at it hard and early than soft and later. Yeah. So no, you're dead right. And going after, like I said, that whole essence of response. That's why the nature of leadership, understanding it, the nature of it, and the subsequent responsibilities, is how you then understand why he's taking this, why he's using this, taking this tact or using this strategy, right? He's going after the person who's ultimately responsible, not causatively, although now he kind of is for the bigger problem, but not originally causative, but he's ultimately responsible. And so by going for the head of the problem, the solution, once you reach the solution in Peter, and Peter comes back to the side of the angels, as we might say, then the dominoes will start falling back into line. Because now Barnabas will go, and I'm saying he doesn't need to go after Barnabas, his own best friend, who he knows Barnabas better than anyone here by a country mile. It's not even close. He doesn't need to go after the person whom he knows best, because Barnabas is going to stand right nearby, and Barnabas might have even been sitting right next to Peter. You wouldn't they know each other well. Barnabas is right nearby, and so now he doesn't need to talk to Barnabas. Barnabas just gets to watch him talk to someone else, and just almost like watching a TV screen in the third person. You're just watching the whole scene play out in front of your own eyes without being literally in it. And so the message is going to get through loud and clear to Barnabas.
Light bulb moment.
Yeah, correct. Because the spotlight's not directly on him, but the spill of the light very clearly falls onto him almost by osmosis, as well as the others. And so bringing the lead, it's by the leadership that these dominoes began to fall. And so by bringing that primary domino back on track, you'll realign the rest. Yeah, it's very, very wise. I'm saying strategically, he just plays it perfectly. So yeah. Anything else?
No.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.